Okay, this video is about Oscar Wilde. He was an academic hero. He was also a screw-up in some other ways, but I really learned a lot from him. You know, I wanted to become a better writer, and Oscar Wilde was a great writer. Also, I'm half Irish. And for Oscar Wilde to go from Ireland to England, where they hated the Irish, and to become the most popular and the best writer in all of the United Kingdom, that's pretty impressive. He was a great talker, and here's some quotes from Oscar Wilde. He lived, by the way, from 1854 to 1900, so he died young, only 46 years of age. Did a lot of his best work in his 20s and 30s. So Oscar Wilde, the aim of conversation is recreation. When he was 16 years old, he was at a Dublin society ball, and he asked a middle-aged famous lady to dance. And she said, "Do you really think I would dance with a child?" And Wilde said, "If I knew you were with child, I wouldn't have asked you." Oscar Wilde continues, "Some people bring happiness and laughter into whatever room they enter." That was my mother. "Others remove it." And so Oscar Wilde, what I loved about him was he would kind of turn everything into a joke, make it fun. Why not? And later on, other persons who took up that style or groups were like Monty Python comedians and Rodney Dangerfield. So here's more quotes from Oscar Wilde. "As a writer, he has mastered everything except language. As a novelist, he can do everything except tell a story. As an artist, he is everything except articulate. He has nothing to say and says it." I was working on a proof of one of my poems all the morning and took out a comma. In the afternoon, I put it back in again. "To win back my youth, I would do anything except take up exercise, wake up early, or be a useful member of the community." Oscar was great with chiasmus, which is the rhetoric form which turns back on itself, like the letter X. It goes back on itself, and man, he was great with that. Here's a typical Oscar Wilde quote. "The only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about." I read a bunch of biographies of him, at least 3 cover to cover and several other ones. I read through all his quotes, anywhere I could get. I collected his quotes. I memorized tons of them. I've got page after page of his quotes. But he was a big self-promoter, but he had to be. You know, no one else was going to promote an Irish guy in England. When Oscar Wilde was coming up, I felt like I was cheering for a friend when I was reading his biographies. And then he went on his tour of America and had all these shows in America. It was rather extraordinary, all the things he did as a young guy. When he was traveling through America, he was asked if he had any declarations at customs, and he said, "I have nothing to declare but my genius." And then he promoted individualism in art. He said, "Only an auctioneer can be equally enthusiastic about all forms of art. Art is the most intense form of individualism the world has ever known. The true artist is a man who believes absolutely in himself. Whenever a community attempts to dictate to the artist what he is to do, art either entirely vanishes or becomes stereotyped and degenerates into a low and ignoble form of craft. A work of art is the unique result of a unique temperament. Its beauty comes from the fact that the author is what he is. It has nothing to do with the fact that other people want what they want. Indeed, the moment that the artist takes notice of what other people want and tries to supply the demand, he ceases to be an artist and becomes a dull tradesman. Alone, without any reference to his neighbors, without any interference, the artist can fashion a beautiful thing. And if he does it not to do it solely for his own pleasure, then he is not an artist at all. It is only by entire isolation from everything that one can do any work. Idleness gives one the mood in which to write. Isolation the conditions. There is no art where there is no style. And there is no style where there is no unity. And unity is of the individual. Okay, I love that because there's so much hype nowadays. Oh, to do research, you need a team and you need a big grant from the university. BS, okay? You know, when you look at the double helix, Watson and Crick just studied on their own. Don't get me wrong, they had help from Wilkins and from Franklin, but Lots of people done incredible, great individual work. Look at Pritikin. Look at McDougall. There was no giant university grant and team of PhD postdoc researchers. No, they were individuals who saw an opportunity to do great things like Kempner and other ones and Burkitt. Okay, Oscar Wilde continues. One style is one signature always. Oscar Wilde used to, he would brag and promote himself. He said, I have single-handedly civilized America by spreading the gospel of art. Oscar continues, an idea that is not dangerous is unworthy of being called an idea at all. Disobedience, in the eyes of anyone who has read history, is man's original virtue. It is through disobedience that progress has been made. Oscar continues, if you want to tell people the truth, make them laugh, or they will kill you. Man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask, and then he will tell you the truth. Young men want to be faithful and are not. Old men want to be unfaithful and cannot. Men want to be a woman's first love. Women want to be a man's last romance. Ultimately, the bond of all companionship, whether in marriage or in friendship, is conversation. Oscar Wilde. Oscar continues, experience is the hardest teacher. It gives you the test first and the lesson afterwards. Misfortunes one can endure. They come from outside. They are accidents. But to suffer from one's own faults, there is the sting of life. How true that is. The most painful regrets are stuff we screwed up. It's our own fault. We can't blame it on anybody else. Oscar continues, it is absurd to divide people into good and bad. People are either charming or tedious. A man's face is his autobiography. A woman's face is her work of fiction. The very essence of romance is uncertainty. An acquaintance that begins with a compliment is sure to develop into a real friendship. It starts in the right manner. Okay, we're going to briefly just mention one of Oscar Wilde's professors at Oxford was John Ruskin. John Ruskin was the most famous art critic of the 1800s in the entire world. And he was a brilliant guy. He was also a little crazy, but when you study all these geniuses, you find that they're all a little crazy. And if you get rid of somebody just because they're a little crazy, you'll never have any geniuses to talk about. So Ruskin was a fascinating guy. I've read a couple biographies on Ruskin as well. A lot of interesting things came out of him. And he was a man who was a big fan of art, but he was also sad for the urbanization of all of England. He saw the industrial age as sort of filthy and polluted. And he was funny in many ways, Ruskin. He was sort of part Scottish, and he was raised a little bit in the puritanical style, reading the Bible. And on the other hand, though, he loved the cathedrals, and he kind of hated the Catholics, but it's sort of like, how can you hate the Catholics and love the cathedrals? And so there was a lot of contorted craziness comes out of Ruskin with regard to art. And then, of course, Oscar Wilde and his friends, like with Potter, for example, were coming at art from a whole different point of view. So there was a big kind of funny clash. But nevertheless, Ruskin is beyond the scope of really talking about in detail here, but I'll just give you a few quotes about him because he was friends with Oscar Wilde and did influence him. So Wilde wrote about Ruskin, the dearest memories of my Oxford days were my walks and talks with you. From you I learned nothing but what was good. There is something of you, in you, of the prophet, the priest, and the poet, and to you the gods gave eloquence, such as they have given none other, so that your message might come to us with the fire of passion and the marvel of music, making the deaf to hear and the blind to see. That was a letter Ruskin wrote. A letter to Ruskin written by Oscar Wilde. And so he was writing to his professor, sort of thanking him. And another comment of Oscar Wilde about Ruskin, Who cares whether Mr. Ruskin's views on Turner are sound or not? What does it matter? That mighty and majestic prose of his is at least as great a work of art as those wonderful sunsets. So yeah, Ruskin was a big fan of the painter named Turner, and Turner was a good painter, but I think Ruskin exaggerated how good he was. But Turner was really right about the pre-Raphaelites, which was a group of English artists who sort of went back to some old stylistic manner. And then they were the best artists that England ever produced, the pre-Raphaelite group, like with Millet, for example, and there were other great ones in that group. So another quote by Oscar Wilde. Art, so far from being a creation of its time, is usually in direct opposition to it. Sometimes it returns upon its footsteps and revives some antique form, as happened in the archaistic movement of late Greek art and in the pre-Raphaelite movement of our own day. So the pre-Raphaelites are the ones that Ruskin supported. Almost done here. I'm sorry about the dogs, but there's not much I could do about it. We're on the last page. When he fell apart in his 1940s, Oscar Wilde did, I felt like a friend had died. You know, I'm half Irish, and I've studied a lot of Irish and English history, especially 1800s and 1900s. Oscar Wilde, grew up, he had nice parents, he was homeschooled like a lot of geniuses. His mother was a writer, his father was an ENT surgeon. I admired him for his development as a writer and his literary accomplishments. He got married and had several children, but then he abandoned them, became an alcoholic, and died, and I felt so bad. It's sort of like he fell apart, Obviously, I know the whole story about Bosie, and I know the whole story about how he was mistreated, but he also, could have bounced back, and he didn't, and he abandoned his kids, and that was pathetic. I was disappointed in him in the end, and, he in his later years, he converted to Catholicism, as did Alfred Douglas, the Marquis of Queensberry, Aubrey Birdsley. They're all people very important in the life of Oscar Wilde. They all became Catholics. So that's all part of his personal story, but, the fact that he became an alcoholic, abandoned his kids rather than going back to writing, supporting his family, that was a big disappointment. I'll just share with you a poem written by his mother, who was also a writer and a big fan of Oscar and helped him a lot. So here's a poem she wrote from the Ballad of the Irish Famine. Weary men, what reap ye? Golden corn for the stranger. What sow ye? Human corpses that await the avenger. Stately ships to bear our food away amid the stranger's scoffing. There's a proud array of soldiers. What do they round your door? They guard our master's granaries for the thin hands of the poor. Lady Jane Wilde. She lived from 1826 to 1896, from the Ballad of the Irish Famine. So that's a pretty sad chapter in Ireland's history, but it's good to remember it because history repeats itself. And they had to send their food away while the Irish people were starving, which is pretty sad. Well, anyways, Oscar was a great writer. He was a lot of fun. He was very clever and funny. One can learn a lot from his style, like the chiasmus, like constantly making jokes. I think the importance of being earnest was his overall funniest, most clever play, but I enjoyed a bunch of them. Anyways, hope that's helpful.